March, in a landmark case on affirmative action, the Supreme Court of Appeal struck down the use of racial quotas in determining job appointments. Gugulethu Mfupi was saying a little bit earlier that she thinks it's a good decision. We'll find out in just a moment whether Tony Healy of Tony Healy Associates agrees with her, and Tony's also got some insights for us on Northam, hasn't he, Googs?
The strike action that's been taken.
Strike action on Northam. So you're a man we're getting double doses from today. Business Day's big story of the day. Did they get it right?
The Northam strike.
No, we're talking about the affirmative action.
My
the racial
apologies.
quotas.
I think, yes, I think, what we have is we have an example in this particular case of circumstances where acceptable numerical targets provided for in the Employment Equity Act are being utilized in a de facto manner as a quota. And the Supreme Court is telling us that's not acceptable, because we know already that quotas are prohibited in the Employment Equity Act. And when one uses numerical goals as de facto quotas, then you're overstepping the mark.
Oh, you're a lawyer, de facto.
De facto, essentially when you're using numerical targets as quotas. So they're supposed to be targets where the objective is to try and reach a demographic of women or blacks or people with disabilities, but you rather use it as a specific quota, so that you then, as happened in this particular case, you then disqualify somebody who ordinarily qualifies for the position by virtue of the fact only that by appointing them you would be overrepresented by, in this particular case, women in that occupational category.
I read the story, and as a black female woman, I was actually shocked as to how such a ruling would come about in the first place. Alec knows I'm a firm believer in working very hard and attaining your skill for whatever position that you'd like, but how did this take us back into the background as to where does this kind of a ruling come from?
Well, what happened in this particular case is that the Captain Barnard applies for a position. She's qualified, she's recommended by the panelists, but we talk about numerical targets. So essentially what that means in simple terms is that employers are required to have a demographic within their organization that reflects the demographic in society. So for argument's sake, if we say that 50% of society is made up of females, then 50% of the workplace must be made up of females within job categories and within job grades. And this was a particular job grade, occupational category, I beg your pardon. So she applied twice. She was recommended twice by the panel, and she was turned down because it would have resulted in white women having been overrepresented in that particular occupational category. So, and ultimately the position was not even filled over a prolonged period of time.
What are the implications of this? It sounds like a really big deal.
Well, I think it is important in the sense that there's been a drift, if you like, in thinking where one is meant to be using numerical targets for precisely that, to say, let's try and see what we can do to make sure we've got the right number of representation, the right representation when it comes to blacks and women and people with disabilities. And those targets in and of themselves are quite acceptable and understandable. But what you can't do, says this particular judgment, you can't say, well, once you've, if you've got nobody in a designated group, if you don't have a female or a black or a person with disabilities to fill that position, but you do have somebody who isn't from a designated group, then you shouldn't turn your back on them as applicants, because what happened here was ultimately the position was not filled, and it was ultimately withdrawn. And you have to ask yourself, if it was important enough to have created and advertised for and
but what's the implication? If I'm running a business, which I do,
yes,
what do I do now? How do I change my employment practices if I must?
Yes, well, all this really means is, if you already have a representation of of females, for example, and in this particular case, let's use the 50% demographic as a cutoff. If you have already have a 50% white female representation, and you have a vacancy, and you have an applicant who is a white female, who is the only suitable person, and it's going to take you over that target, then you would have to appoint that person.
Why isn't there an emphasis maybe more on skills development and skills transfer at large, not dependent on race or whatever demographic representation that you want?
Well, in this particular case, the woman in question had all of the required skills. The problem is that it would have resulted in SAPS exceeding its numerical targets in terms of the representation of white females. So all of these appointments presuppose that you have the prerequisite skills.
Well, interesting. Tony, sorry, we didn't get to Northam, unfortunately, and that was Tony Healy from Tony Healy Associates. I'm sure we'll pick up on the Northam story in due course.